I'll tell you how this kind of originated. And interestingly enough, it was actually from my brother. Over the years, through kind of hard times, my brother will just show up via a text message in the middle of the night, just, checking in, those kind of things. And it's interesting as I look back that through different challenges I've gone through, he and my other brother have been there to kind of just those little words in those moments. And this story or this idea actually came from one of those conversations where I was kind of going through a tough time. And I'm the youngest of the three, right, of brothers. And the comment was reading he had done about Navy SEALs and their training, which is super intense. And he had talked about, this story about a Navy SEAL or something like that was, trying to get up a mountain. They were doing these big hikes that they had to do for their training. And he was just so spent, like he was just struggling so hard that what he began to do was like set like these little focal points for himself just to get to that point. And then when he got to that point, he would look for the next one. And so my brother said to me, like sometimes in life, that's what we got to do, right? Like there's really hard times and it's hard to look too far ahead. Just find your little spot, work to get there, and then, go the extra spot. So that was the initial little note. And then, that thought just kind of stuck with me. And I started thinking more and more about it and started thinking about our life, and in how many ways it's like we're climbing a mountain. And in many ways, there's times where there is rescue needed.
This piece of writing was a harrowing adventure tale that had my blood running cold, and I was, on the edge of my seat trying to find out what was going to happen next, and putting myself in the, position of the characters in this like short piece of writing. It was, truly amazing and the most raw and real situation where, you're in a situation where you don't know what to do. You don't necessarily know how to proceed. Like you got the fog of war and you've got a mission, but the whole mission's blown apart and you're trying to figure out on the fly what's the best way to proceed. And there's danger at every step, and there's people that need help, and you're just barely hanging on. And you've heard some tidbits of training from other people. Like we're not Army Rangers, right? But we've watched some movies and seen some things, and those are the experiences that we draw on. Like this guy, his friend told him one time, just break it up into chunks, right? So that's what he did. But I was fascinated by the story. I felt really compelled to consider being in that position, and I really think the metaphor or allegory of kind of climbing the hill to get to the rescue point, I think is a really apt metaphor. I guess it seems like life is just truly an uphill journey, ultimately away from life and towards death. And it leads to death for everybody. And you've got some critical choices to make along the way. And, there's only one way out, only one rescuer at the end of it. Right. But it's, life's meant to be difficult. And, when it is like that, when you're in a situation like this and you're so close to death, like you feel like you're truly living, right? As opposed to kind of sitting on the couch watching TV or just cheering on your sports team or going for a country drive or singing in church or whatever. This is as real and raw as it gets, and the opportunity to play that role of a hero, I think it's something that we would die for that opportunity, literally or metaphorically. So I was really captivated by the story, and I think it has a lot of food for thought.
Well, in the big picture, I've kind of got a bit of a problem with this story. Not the story itself. I think it's great. I think this is a story of how a man wants to see himself. I think it's a story of how God has designed the man, the male, in his image. My problem, I guess, is I'm not sure. I know men want to be the hero. As boys, we grew up wanting to be the hero of the story. We still want to be the hero. But I guess my question or my problem is, do men really take this kind of personal sacrifice that we're talking about in this story? Do men really actually get involved and put themselves in a position to sacrifice the way this story talks about? Is there a gap between who we want to be in our hearts, who God's made us to be, and who we really are from day to day? You mentioned, Daryl, about, watching TV on the couch. I'm just as guilty as anybody, liking to watch my sports on TV. But there's another part of our lives, isn't there, where we are called to be heroes and courageous for others, and where we also submit to God's rescuing in our lives.
I think the quick answer to that question from my standpoint and from my experience, Dave, is the desire may be there, But the answer is probably no. Do we actually make this kind of personal sacrifice? Not often. As this was being written, I was asking myself like deeply some of these questions, questions like, what truly is our brother's, life worth to us, and how far would we go to save it, right? Yeah. It's one thing to maybe have a quick answer in your head, but I think if we actually stop and really think about that, I think the reality is that, brotherhood is kind of a lost concept in our culture, definitely a lost concept in our church environments. We look at each other like brothers, or talk to each other like we're brothers, but, when push comes to shove, are we actually there in those moments, those critical moments when, a brother is on the side of the mountain about to fall? Are we there to get him and pull him back on? And I think that's not only the close ones, but even ones that are maybe a little bit distant, right? Maybe more the distant ones that are a little bit further out, right? The ones that, have showed up once or twice to a meeting, but, they don't come too often. Like, do we view them as brothers, right? And do we go that extra mile to save them if we can, or if we have the chance to?
Yeah.
We live in a time where our tensions are divided between ourselves and our families and our band of brothers, right? Mm-hmm. And we have to have some priorities. And I think, like, for the most part, our family or ourself, not in a good way, but like would be the priority. So we put the band of brothers like third, and we're not going to find ourselves in these types of situations where it's truly life or death. If you don't risk your life, that your brother's going to die. And I think if we were in that situation, we might, act heroically, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't find ourselves in these situations, but we do find ourselves in situations, right? And I think the concept that you talked about, Ben, of kind of chunking or just breaking the whole mission or the journey. We got a life of 80 years or 90 years or whatever it's going to be. And, we got to break it up into chunks. And if God's put us in a position where the challenge ahead of us is spending some time talking to the wife, like we talked about before, and that's the heroic act of the day, then so be it. And you can fail that pretty easily, and we all have failed that. But I think if you do the next right thing, whether it's big or small, that's hero training. Mm. Or ultimately, if God sets you up in a situation where your life is just abounding with peace, and those are your greatest challenge, and you're able to accomplish it and be, gracious and merciful and, giving and helpful to people, and you just have a life of peace. You don't have to do any of these life rescues, then great. But you do the next thing that's put in front of you, big or small, and that's hero training. Good. But we, when do we get ourselves into a situation where we have to, make that choice, like in this story, where you have to, if we're in a situation where our brother beside us is wounded and we're on some sort of adventure and you need to drag them 10 kilometers to them, I don't think any of us is not going to do that, right? I mean, if we had to run and leave them and run and get help and come back, we would all consider that. This story amps it up to the next level where you're already doing that and you're reaching the extraction point and you are at your end of your line. You're running out of oxygen, running out of energy. And that's when you hear, a brother mile away on the cliffside crying for help. And you have to make a decision. Are you going to, leave the brother who's hurt already close to the extraction point and risk your life, which there's no guarantee you're going to make it there. And certainly no guarantee you're going to pull your brother back to take it to that next level. That's it's almost like a paradox, right? It's kind of like just say the abortion question. People that don't like abortion don't like it, but most people argue. They say, what about if the life of the mother is in jeopardy? Well, that's truly a difficult question to answer, right? Like, because you're there's two lives in the balance. You have to make a decision. And, being a hero or taking a heroic act is all about making the right decision, the self-sacrificial decision in the moment, right? So I think it's good preparation to think about these things and to plan, but to remember that every day we're training, right? Because if we say, nah, not for me, no, I'm not going to take the time with the wife, I'm not going to, help that person that needs it there in those little moments, it's going to be hard pressed for us to be ready.
Yeah, and I think, on that point, I think, not overlooking those little moments, right? Sometimes it is the little things that are truly bigger than we realize, right? Like to your point, Daryl, we're not talking about physically being on this mountain, most likely for most of us, right? But in our lives, what does that look like, right? What do the mountains in our life look like? And what do those situations look like, right? And, they may not seem as extreme as this story goes, but in the big scheme of things, for that man that's hanging off the side of the cliff, whatever that looks like in our lives, it is a big deal. It is a big deal.
Well, fear is a big part of our lives nowadays, both in terms of the way the world is and in our own personal lives. We find with talking with marriages and coming alongside marriages, fear is one of the big issues that people are facing in their lives and relationships. So there's a way of looking at fear as being real, very real in people's lives, and we need people to come alongside and encourage us in those times of fear, and we need that courage from the Lord. Ben, just back to the story for a minute. You have two parts in the story, and between part 1 and 2, you've got an interlude, it says, and you have some important questions. Would you like to read those questions to us?
Yeah, well, I think it's like we're talking about here. I think it's trying to figure out how we take this story and apply it to the lives that we're all living, right? So what exactly are we talking about here? Like, what is the rescue plan that we're talking about? What is the situation? Like, what is this disaster situation or the place that we find ourselves in our life? Who is it that we turn to when we get into those tough situations? Like, do we have somebody, or do we have others who are coming to us and asking us for, calling out for help? What should be our response? When we're called to for help. Like, it's all these things that how do we take it and how do we take this, yes, kind of over the top extreme story, but kind of bring it into our lives that we're living today, right? So, I'd be interested to kind of hear some of the thoughts on some of that.
Yeah, Ben, I think this, like, and Dave, this story, the allegory of the mountain, we are literally, metaphorically, walking up a mountain in our lives, and we don't see it that way, but our life is, if we're trying to live a godly life, we're trying to walk closer and closer and get closer to God as we move through this life. And the challenges we face get, more increasingly difficult. The deeper you go with God, the more that's given to you, the more that's expected of you, right? So it gets more challenging as you go, which is like a, consideration of the uphill climb getting steeper, right? And I think if you were to get as close to God as Moses did, or, when they were with Jesus at the Transfiguration, that's like a, straight up trajectory, right? This mountain. But, life's getting harder, and there's people falling away alongside of us as we go. And maybe we'll be blessed beyond blessed and walk through and reach Christ at the top, and that's all good. But that's not all that life is about. There are people put into our lives along the way, our brothers and even, strangers or acquaintances that come across that, like, we do have varying degrees of accountability too, right? And if we're talking about our band of brothers along the way, then we have like a very high degree of responsibility and accountability to them as we do other loved ones, right? So as we go through this uphill walk up the mountain, if you look at life of 80 years or whatever, condensed down to a 2-day period, as you're climbing up this mountain, and this guy in the stories, getting more fatigued and running out of oxygen, and that's how our life gets. When you get in the last quarter of your life, it gets a little harder to breathe. Your muscles are a little worn down, so you're actually getting yourself in this situation. The one challenge is like the cry for help in a survival situation like this would be very explicit, and you'd know exactly what is required of the person, I suppose. Whereas in life, the spiritual cries often require a bit of discernment, or can be, disregarded a little easier on your conscience, right? You can just say, "Oh, I didn't know that's what was going on," right? But it's very obvious if somebody's sitting there with a bleeding leg and on the side of a mountain, what they need. But what's the rescue plan, right? We know that we're not getting out of this life alive, right? The only rescue plan we have is to keep marching forward, higher and higher, following Christ, and get to the point where He whisks us away to heaven, whether it's in resurrection or rapture or whatever. But along the way, the only way that the fallen ones are going to get to that rescue plan is through us, and Christ has given us that mission to pick up and carry those along the way and bring them to Christ as well. And if we consider the metaphor of this story and consider life, then the only rescue plan is through Jesus Christ. There's no other way, no other religion, no other money, no other like kind actions, no, nothing, right? It's only Jesus. So how will they know unless they're called or told about Jesus? And we gotta figure out, if we're ready, willing, and able to do that along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like kind of what you're saying is like ultimately, and I know this is where the story leads, but ultimately it's really all of us that need rescuing, right? And I think that's a slightly different angle on this whole story. Like, here's the thing, right? You know, we all want to be the hero, right? The guy that's carrying the guy on his back and going and grabbing the other guy, and you know, the ones that we watch while we're sitting on the couch. You know, but how many of us are okay being the one getting rescued?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I'm being honest, you know, on this podcast coming in here tonight, I kind of want to be the guy tonight that's getting carried. I'm coming in having a hard week, right? That's the reality of most of our lives, is that, you know, sometimes we are that guy that's going and grabbing the other guy or carrying somebody on our shoulder, but then there's other times that we're the one that's about to fall and we're calling out, right? And you know, it's truly encouraging to me to have people like you, Daryl, people like you, Dave, who's, you know, later in their life, if you want to say, who is still listening to those calls and reaching down and helping people up, right? And so I think it's something that we need to consider, that, you know, yes, you know, be the hero, but also, yes, you know, be rescued.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, as we're talking, I'm thinking about, imagine every man who's listening to this podcast. I know Ben and Daryl and myself, Dave, I know that we are all, you know, climbing that mountain in certain ways, whether it's our personal lives or our marriage or family, or in my case, it's kind of a very serious illness in the family. So in many ways, we are aware ourselves as brothers here that we are, each of us, climbing this mountain, and we probably understand that people listening to this have their mountains as well. So yeah, we are called to be in fellowship with each other, not to be lone wolves, but to be together in fellowship and caring for each other that way.
I think it's you know, time that, you know, we start being a little bit honest with each other, right? I think we need to be vulnerable.
Mm.
We need to be okay being weak at times, because I truly don't believe until we put ourselves or get ourselves into the place where we need to be rescued, will we ever be able to go on and genuinely rescue somebody else.
Right.
Whether that be, you know, reaching up to, you know, somebody close to you, or whether that be, you know, just in our, you know, being rescued by Christ, right? Like, I'm not sure that we say it, right? But, you know, are we really okay, and do we accept what Christ really did for us? And are we okay to take that position of the one that's being carried? And ultimately, you know, it's Christ who's going to take us, right?
Right.
To get to what we're talking about, this brotherhood that we're talking about in this story, into our lives or into our little band of brothers that we have around us, I think it's about, you know, being all three of those brothers in this story, right, at different times, right? And I think it's about, you know, being honest about those times. And there may be times where, you know, there's two that need to be thrown over the shoulder, and one's going to do a bit of the weightlifting. But you know, it's a struggle. Our life can be a struggle, and you know, this is the position we have to take to get to the top, right, and to get out.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we all as men would love to play the hero, and we do have different opportunities to do it, and I'm sure we've all missed some of them and have regrets in our lives. And luckily, or, you know, thankfully to God, that there'll be more opportunities to do the next right small thing or big thing that's set before us. And, you know, ultimately what's even more important than fulfilling your obligation to be a hero in those moments is the realization that ultimately we are going to be in that vulnerable, crying out, broken body and spirit, needing Christ to rescue us. And that's infinitely more important than being the hero ourselves. So, you know, we do have a debt because Christ, you know, went out of his way and he risked his life time after time and gave the ultimate sacrifice to save us. And what he asked for us in return is to kind of reach out and look for the lost as well, and, you know, really do the same thing. And, you know, if that call for the ultimate sacrifice comes, you know, we have to weigh in our hearts if we really truly believe that kind of that symbolism of baptism, that like you kind of die to your old self and are reborn, that your old self is dead and your life doesn't have the same earthly value that it did before, that our value is now found in Christ, that if he calls you to risk it for something that, you know, we got to consider that that's something that maybe we should do. And it's just, it's difficult because, the Bible says in Romans, rarely for a righteous man will one die, but maybe for a good man, someone might dare to die, so it's hard. It's not easy, but, Jesus gives us enough examples where he's willing to leave the 99 and come after the one that's lost, right? And I think ultimately, this life as we walk, the goal is to leave it all on the field, right? At the end of the game, be totally spent, have nothing left, and just to be an empty vessel and let Christ fill us back up if that's his will, right? But, we want to give God all the glory, and, just remember that he's the true hero, the true rescuer, and the true savior.